welcome to the Team Deakins podcast. This podcast is a dialogue between Roger and James Deakins, starting with a submitted question or topic and ending who knows where. We will also be joined by guests for some topics. If you'd like to submit a question, email it to webmaster@rogerdeakins.com. Today's topic is lens choices. We're going to talk about how you make that choice and why you make that choice. Raj, what goes through your mind when you think about what lenses you want to use?
There's a sort of general discussion you have with a director about the mood of the film, the kind of look of the film, as everybody calls it. But generally it's a scene-to-scene thing. There's not that many films where locked into a certain palette of lenses, as it were. I remember discussing with Joel and Ethan Fargo, for instance, after shooting a Hudsucker Proxy. Now, Hudsucker Proxy was quite a stylized film. It was quite exuberant in the camera moves. And yes, it was pushed a bit. It was quite a lot of wide lens work deliberately for the reason to make the camera feel active and make a lot of the spaces seem bigger than they were. Everything wanted to be slightly larger than life in a way. And then when that film didn't do so well at the box office, the guys decided to do Fargo, which is something they had in mind for a long time, back in their home, really, in Minnesota. And it was very low budget. The thing about the lenses was they wanted the feeling of it being almost like a documentary reconstruction of something, a real true event. So we talked about shooting that slightly longer lenses. We also talked about not moving the camera at all, but in the end, the first shot we did was like 120-foot track. But there's still the kind of the overall feeling of the film held. We didn't always shoot on a 40 or 50 mil, but it was slightly longer lenses than it had been on Hudsucker, for sure. It was 35 or 40 mil was more standard for us,
So aesthetically, what would you say the different focal lengths give you?
Well, it's a matter of the perspective you're giving the audience, really. If anybody can do it for themselves. Put a camera on a face and reproduce the same size face using a 25 mil and then using a 50 mil. And it's the relationship with the viewer to the distance to the character, but then the relationship with that character to the background. Obviously, it changes. I've never understood really I have. People say there's a normal lens, what your eye sees, but I'm looking around now. I'm looking at you as I talk to you, and I'm looking in your eye, and I'm looking at your eye, and I'm probably on about 1,000 mil looking at your eye. I'm aware of what's around, but only really as I pan and track with my eye do I take it all in. So the idea that human's eye is like 42 millimeter, which a lot of people say is, doesn't make sense to me, really. We have selective vision because it's the way we observe things. We're taken by some object and we kind of almost zoom in on it, like the door handle in the sun over there, the patch of light on the floor. I'm looking at that. I'm looking like it's on a 2,000 mil, but that's not really my eye. My eye is really almost like a fisheye.
Yeah.
Fisheye lens. So it's a funny thing, really. So it's about connectivity with the audience. I think that, I'm sitting here talking to you and we're 5 feet apart. And if I wanted to shoot you on a close up as though you were this distance away, that's what I'd do. 50 mil or 65 mil, and it would feel normal,
Right. So when you look at a film, when you're prepping a film, at that point, do you get an idea of the lenses that you want to use?
It's very few films where I've really, I suppose, in a way, gone outside the sort of palette of lenses I would normally use.
Which is
standardly, I would kind of like an over the shoulder would be a 32 or 35. A mid shot would be 35 or 40, and a standard close up would be a 50, and a big close up would be a 65 or a 75.
Right.
You know, it's that range. I'm not somebody that shoots on very long lenses. I know, like say a Ridley Scott often shoots on a 120 or something. I don't know, but they, you know, a lot of people shoot a lot longer. A lot of people shoot a lot wider. Look at Chivo and shooting the Revenant on a 12 mil and a 14 mil. I mean.
And then sometimes we know that there are certain scenes that we're going to use a specific lens on, and we just make sure we rent it for those days.
Yeah, you have certain moments. I mean, I don't usually have a zoom lens in my package on a film, but then sometimes you want a particular shot that is a zoom shot.
Well, that was what I was going to talk about next, was primes versus zooms.
Well, I always like primes because I like the fact that it forces you to make a decision where you're going to put the camera and what lens are you going to put it on. It's such a sloppy thing to say, oh, well, we'll just put it on a zoom so we don't have to move the camera, we can go in for a close-up. But then suddenly your relationship with that close-up is different. You've gone in on 100 mil on a zoom to shoot a close-up instead of moving the camera into somebody on a 50 mil. So it's a totally different relationship. But then that all balances out with what's the perspective of the film. If the film is from one character's perspective, for instance, then you want to shoot them on the wider lens. If the person they're talking to is not the main character, you don't want them to feature so much, then maybe you shoot them on a longer lens, so they feel like it's more from the perspective of your main character. So there's a whole balance of how lenses you use, you know. I mean, the last film we've done, God, it seems a long time ago now, 1917, we only used one lens.
Right.
We had to use one lens because it was one shot. Or, you know, that was in essence what we wanted people to feel it was. And so we deliberately didn't do a wide lens. We didn't want that feeling of seeing the whole world. We wanted, a long discussion with Sam about how we were going to narrow it down and actually use it so there was slightly less depth of field. We didn't see around the characters. The film was about two characters. Ended up being about the one character, but it was personal to their experience of the world around them. So we basically ended up shooting on what did we shoot on?
It was on a 40.
Yeah, it was on a 40.
Mm-hmm. But that was a signature prime, so they were slightly different.
Yeah, so it was a 40, which
35, I think,
which was equivalent of maybe 35, maybe slightly wider. Yeah, 32 probably.
But that also was the bigger sensor, so hence the lens acted slightly differently.
Yeah, so it acted like a wider lens, but you still had the drop off, the fall off that you would get on a 40 mil, whatever. You know, that sense of slightly focused on the character with the drop off onto the background. That slight isolation, but it's nothing like, it's not like a long lens. Obviously, it's quite a wide lens still.
Yeah. And optically, would you say there's a difference between a prime and a zoom?
Not so much now, but I mean, there used to be.
Yeah.
I mean, it used to be huge. I mean, when I was shooting documentaries, I used to shoot on a 16 mil, and I used to shoot on a 5.9 to 57 little short zoom, which is a great little lens. But then when I started doing drama, I moved to shooting on prime lenses. And one of the first films I did was a Super 16 film. And I took a load of contact stills lenses and had them adapted to work with an Arton 16mm camera just to get the best quality, sharpest image, best coverage I could, you know. I'm not somebody that I don't like artifacts. I don't like flares. I don't like vignetting. I don't like old lenses. Why would I use old lenses? I want to use the lens that most reflects what I see with my eye, and I think my vision's quite sharp. So I like, you know, if I want to destroy the image or create a vignette, I'll do it as a particular effect with a particular lens, like on Jesse James, but I wouldn't do it on the standard thing.
On Jesse James, we had them take some lenses and take some of the elements out so it would vignette along the edges, because we tried that digitally, and it wasn't the same effect.
Yeah, you didn't get the color aberration, and the halation. Yeah.
And it's the only time we've really done something crazy with a lens.
Yeah, pretty well, yeah.
And afterwards, we sent them back to Otto Nemitz, who asked us, "Oh, could we rent these out?"
Yeah,
so
they're quite popular, aren't they?
You can rent them out as the Deaconizer lenses.
Yeah, that all came from experimenting. I years and years ago, I was doing an effect in a cinema short, it was, and I wanted a certain vignetting effect, and I had an old stills lens, so I took the front element off and put it in front of a 50mm standard 50mm lens for a 35mm film camera, and just played with the distance and stuff away from the lens to get that sort of effect. So when we did Jesse James, that's why I talked to Otto Nemitz about manufacturing something similar, or that idea,
One thing that might be interesting is to talk about how we test lenses when a new lens set comes out or something. We oftentimes check it out.
Yeah, I mean, we did a lot of testing, didn't we, with the master primes when they were first being developed, and we actually did a lot of testing of the Leica lenses when Leica started making lenses for 35mm film cameras.
Well, one of the things that we would always do is point it towards a bare bulb.
I think that's the most telling. That's the hardest thing. You just shoot a lens with right towards a bare light bulb with no other light in a dark room. Just hang a light in the middle of the room, maybe hitting a little bit of a wall, but basically a point source in a black space. That's the hardest thing for any lens to cope with.
It's actually very interesting to see what the different lenses do.
Yeah, because you get such different kinds of flare and lens aberration off it. It's very, very interesting. Sometimes you get, I'm not very good at what these technical terms for it is, but the kind of color vignetting in the flare around it comes off it, and depending on the angle of the camera and angle of the lens to the bulb, and it's really interesting. And sure, I don't think there's a single lens that will be dead clear, and they all have different aspects and different looks, but for most of it is I don't like lens effects. They take me away from the image, but one of the most important things is to have a set that matches. Because there's nothing worse than if you're shooting a shot with a light bulb in shot on a 35mm, and then you put a 50 on, and suddenly it's a totally different flare pattern coming off it, and you've got a kind of rainbow set of colors going around the edge of the frame. It happens, and that's kind of annoying. So I mean, you're not often in those circumstances, but sometimes you are. I mean, when we were doing Lady Killers, I lit one whole scene with a couple of bare light bulbs and little gags behind the bare light bulb, but they were basically bare bulbs. It's kind of tough for any camera to sort of do, But there's also all sorts of other tests. I mean, one of the other aspects of a lens I don't like is breathing when you pull focus. Because, I mean, I kind of done a lot of films like Blade Runner where you're not moving the camera, and the film plays on a long shot held over quite a lot of the action. And there's nothing worse if you're pulling focus and suddenly the whole edge of the frame is swimming. Right. I find that really so annoying. It just takes me out of the image.
Or you get to the end of the rack and it goes in a little bit and then comes back.
It's not even it might not even be consistent. Yeah. So I mean, without being a salesman for Arian master primes, you do not see them move. You don't see them move.
I remember we were asked to look at some lenses that were just coming out, and we went to look at them, and there were a lot of problems, but one of them was that breathing was terrible.
Breathing was terrible.
And I said, wow, that's a lot of breathing. And they actually said to me, well, some people like that. Some people
like it. Yeah. That's what I've never really liked about, early days of anamorphic, when you had to have two lenses. You had a second lens with the main, I don't know how it worked, but it was a double lens system on anamorphic.
Wow.
And they used to breathe like crazy. And I could never get to like that. Of course, you don't have that problem now, or not so much.
But generally, we go through the script and you have an idea of what lenses you want to use. And so you end up just with those lenses in the lens kit.
Yeah, I have a very small package, really. I mean, my whole camera package is very small relative to, I think, a lot of other people's.
I know it drives Andy crazy. He likes backup.
He likes backup, yeah.
But we always have a second set of lenses, especially if you're shooting in the wintertime outside and then you're going inside to shoot something.
Yes.
We'll take one set of lenses and let it sit in the warmth inside and use the other ones outside, so we wouldn't be having to use a lens with condensation on it.
Yes, and most films we've done, there's always been the odd chance you use two cameras, so you would have a second set of lenses, and you always have a second body as a backup anyway, so you always have the ability to shoot with two cameras if it was, if you just needed a safety shot or something, right. Just a static shot you needed to put in for something. But yeah. And then if you did do, like on Skyfall or something, we had a lot of scenes where we shooted multiple cameras, or Jarhead, which is, we shot handheld, but with Scott Sakamoto doing B camera a lot of the time, then you'd always have the two sets of equipment every day, even though sometimes you weren't using it.
Yeah, well, and also sometimes when you have another camera, you set the other camera up for the shot that's coming after this one if you're really under the gun.
Yeah.
So you might have the lens on it, you might have it all ready to go, and then swap it out.
That was a bit of a hard thing to explain for the production on and Arri on 1917, because it was a single camera and one lens. But we were changing over from different rigs, from wire rigs to Trinity rig to a Steadicam to our main use was a Stabileye gyro head, and they all had to be balanced out. So you couldn't just swap a camera from one to another, because each camera was slightly different weight or whatever, slightly different configuration. So you had to have these up and ready. So yeah, we had to have three. We couldn't have functioned without three bodies, three cameras. Right. Not three sets of lenses, but the basic camera and
yeah. But that took a bit of explaining to Arri, because you're talking with the technical guys and says, but we're giving you a camera ahead of time. Why do you need anything else? And you're only shooting it with one camera. And I just kept saying, no, we won't do it if we don't have three. And also we were using a prototype too. So we wanted to make sure.
Yeah. But they were great.
They were fantastic.
They were fantastic.
They were absolutely fantastic. So what do you think sometimes when you go through with the storyboard artist and you're explaining what the shot is and it comes back and it's completely not the right lens in the frame?
Yeah, well, I don't really take that much notice of storyboards, really.
Yes, but other people sometimes do. So. No,
I mean, they're just a reference. I do find it odd, It's funny working in animation, isn't it? Because you try and especially we started at Pixar on WALL-E, and they wanted a sort of film look. And then you would look at their rough layouts, and then you think like it'd be a 38.5 millimeter lens, and you think, well, where do they get that from? They wanted live action feel, but they were going all across the board in terms of lenses. I always thought that was kind of funny. They still do it, really.
Well, I remember on Blade Runner, the problem with previs, that visual effects would do this previs so we would know exactly what was happening, but then they'd use like a 59 millimeter lens. And we're like, what is this?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Now, the thing about the lens choice, it's a sort of psychological thing. And again, like I say, it's the effect you want to create for the audience. How do you want the audience to feel? What's their perspective on the image you're showing them? And that's why, I don't like shooting multiple cameras most of the time. Obviously, you have to do it on certain stunt shots, or sometimes it's good to do two camera. We did quite a bit of two camera work on Dead Man Walking, because some of those jail scenes, Susan and Sean were kind of ad-libbing on the dialogue, and it would have been really hard if you were only getting one angle and then you try to shoot the other angle match to the emotional performance, but also the flow of the dialogue on the other side. So that makes a lot of sense. I did one film where the director was insisting on shooting on 5 cameras on one time on a scene of these guys around in a bar or around a table in a bar. And it was insane because, you know, the wide shot was it's before you couldn't paint out cameras. So the wide shot's out there on, you know, a 25. So all the coverage had to be shot on really long lenses. It didn't make any sense at all. And none of it cut. It was just absolutely horrendous. It was nonsense. I get so angry. Anytime I talk to a director I haven't worked with and I get approached about shooting a film, and that's what I get into. I say, well, you know, how do you like to shoot? Do you like zoom lenses? Do you like multiple cameras? You know, and it was funny. You know, I shot Bar and Fink with Joel and Ethan, the first film I did with them, and it wasn't till later on they told me how they'd come across me. They wanted somebody new, obviously, and they thought they'd seen some of my work, and then they asked different directors how I worked. And they asked this one director, who I hadn't gone on with at all. And he said, Roger, he likes to operate himself. He hates zoom lenses. He doesn't like multiple cameras. He likes to discuss things before you start shooting. He doesn't like second unit. He likes to do all the stunts, you know, flying in helicopters himself. And all this as though it was all...
He's just horrible.
It was everything that he thought he hated. And Joel said to me later, he said, it was funny, everything he said, it was quite vitriolic. But he said, but it was all exactly how we feel about it. So although the director was not giving me a good reference, he actually was. He didn't think he was, but he was. And it's, you know, everyone's got a different way of doing things. I just can't work with, you know, as a zoom lens, as a standard lens, and I can't work with multiple cameras as a standard way of covering drama. It just doesn't work for me, you know.
Well, the zoom lenses are usually bigger anyway. Right.
Well, that's it. You've got these tiny cameras now, and people put on like 25 to 1, 25 to 250 zoom lens on the front, and it's like 3 feet out from the front. And you think, what's the point of having a little camera and trying to be intimate and trying to be intimate for the actors' performances and everything else? And you've got all this massive equipment around you. It's just, doesn't that not defeat the kind of the feeling on the set, the kind of intimacy of a set? I think it does.
So would you say basically you just don't like the feeling of a long lens?
No, that's not right. I mean, I feel maybe it's because I started in stills and documentaries, and if you're shooting a conversation, you know, and you're moving around, something is happening with a number of people or just two people, and you want to go from an over shoulder here to the over shoulder on the reverse side. Well, you're not going to shoot on 100 mil because time you get from one side to the other, it's about 10 minutes to walk around, and then you've missed the conversation. And if you want to make it usable, if you're on a slightly wider lens, you can fade off to the character that's talking, arc around them, walk around them, and end up on the over the shoulder the other way. But you can only do that if you're actually in there with the conversation on a, you know, if it was 16 mil on like a 15 mil or something. But you're not going to do that on a, again, 16 mil. You're not going to do that on the 57 or something. It's just not going to happen. You know, and I like, not only that, I like the feeling that you're there, that you're putting the audience in that conversation.
Yeah.
You know, you're part of it. You know?
I find sometimes the long lenses where the background goes soft, I feel like I'm watching a movie.
Yes, I think it's true, yeah. I mean, it can work wonderfully in certain movies. I mean, there's some movies where it's a fantastic effect. But I think you have to consider why you're doing it and what that effect is, not just do it because it looks pretty. That's the problem. I mean, that's the problem with all cinematography. There's danger with any cinematography, not with all cinematography, but danger with any cinematography is that you get swept away by the prettiness of something, the attractiveness of something, the coolness of something. Oh, if we move the camera like this is really clever. Or this light looks great. But then, oh, this looks better on a longer lens because it's all out of focus and then we can put something in the foreground. It all looks really pretty. But is it right? Does it really help the story? You know, it becomes for its own sake. That's the danger. I'm not saying everybody does it, but that's the danger. And I sometimes have to stop myself. And there's been a few occasions working with directors like with Sam on Jarhead, where he would say to me, "Oh, no, Roger, that's not right." Or I'd say to him, "Yeah, but we can't do that. You know, it's maybe a great idea, but it's not, it doesn't fit with our whole scheme, you know." Mm-hmm. And I think if you have one shot that takes you out in a whole series, you're trying to create a mood, and you have this one shot that stands out as ostentatious or for its own sake or something, you've just dispelled the whole mystery and the whole immersive experience of the film, haven't you, I think?
Would you say that when you're first talking with a director about the film, is that informing you what lenses? I mean, if he's giving you an idea of the kind of look that he wants, or would you just say you just have your lens pack?
No, I think the first discussion is always get a sense of their perspective on the film. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't really hone in on the look of the film. I think that's something that just evolves. I think really is something that evolves. It's not very rare that a director has a locked on concrete idea of something. That's in my true. Experience, visually at the beginning. Andrew Dominic maybe closest to anybody. I mean, he'd been working on that Jesse James for so long and had so many things in his mind. But even that evolved, went through prep and looked at locations and discussed sets and costumes and looked at references. It always evolves. And then even on the day. And I say, I go back to Fargo and our whole conversation with Joel and Ethan, the whole conversation about it being observational, like it was a drama documentary, like this was reality happening and you didn't want to move the camera in any ostentatious way. And yet the very first shot we did was a 120-foot track in the snow. And I can remember because I didn't have much track with me because we weren't going to move the camera. And suddenly it was like, let's do Steve Buscemi kind of struggling across the snow, and we needed to move 120 feet. But the film still had the same effect that we were after, I think. But, it evolves. It evolves.
Well, it's also interesting because your lens choice can change what the shot is telling someone, because I know sometimes there are shots that look like somebody's it's a POV of someone, which is sometimes, when misused, quite confusing because you think, oh, the villain's in the bushes or
There's
something.
A certain language.
Yeah.
And a language is not something written down by filmmakers. It's something experienced in the world by us as we translate what we see, So I guess you have to be very careful when you're choosing the lenses and looking at it and saying, what is this frame telling me? Absolutely. It's the lens choice, it's the frame, it's what's in the frame, the balance of the frame, whether it's a formal, symmetrical frame, whether it's off balance. There's such a complex palette that you've got to play with, colors, light, that's what's wonderful about it, really.
What if you were shooting something and you used different lens packages? Would that be odd? Like you use some prime, master prime, some Zeiss, some this, some that.
Oh, people do, don't they?
Do they?
Yeah, people do. It's like people use different, they go from 16mm to 35 to 8mm. They do different lenses. They might use Baltars for one scene and then something else for another scene. Oh, yeah.
To me, though, different lenses really look so different.
Yeah, it depends. Not the only time, but sometimes you want to make certain scenes sort of have a different kind of quality. I was thinking about Beautiful Mind, where we flashed all the film, didn't we? That was meant to be the period part of Nash's life, where he's at Princeton. We flashed all the film to get a kind of flat, and we flashed it with a golden light. So everything with this kind of saturated golden look that stood out from the rest of the movie. And I think we shot that with slightly longer lenses and we had less camera movement. So it had a different quality. But you didn't want to go so far that it didn't feel like the same movie, you know what I mean?
So
but I've rarely done it with lenses other than Jesse James, you know.
So if you were doing flashbacks or something, or dreams or something that you really wanted to be different, changing the lens package, you know, going to a different set
option,
might work.
Yeah, it's definitely an option. There's all sorts of things you can do. Yeah, I mean, there's so much you can do now, just digitally changing it if you want to. The thing I don't really, the thing I don't subscribe to is like, and we had this discussion, Sam and I, on 1917. It's like the past doesn't look like anything different than the present, and probably the future won't look any different. You know, it might look a bit hotter, but it won't look any different visually. The light will still basically be the same, apart from the amount of pollution in the air. I mean, you know what I mean? So the idea of making 1917, you know, sepia or something, doesn't work. And the idea of shooting it on an old lens. Now, to say that, there's some films that have done that that I think are kind of amazing. Like Ozzie Morris was a master at creating different worlds and different textures. Like you look at Fiddler on the Roof, which he used nets on the front of the lens and stuff to create that kind of slightly smoky golden world. And then look at Moby Dick, where they were printing, you know, the 3-strip Technicolor process, the old, what do they call it? But it's ink process. It's a dye line process. But he created a brown dye. So instead of the 3 colors, you're making this parchment kind of quality to the image with a brown dye. I mean, that's like, wow, that's fantastic. I mean, there's no way you could do it now, but because the technology, but it is that he wanted the feeling of an old picture, and we did something, you know, on Oh Brother We're Out There. We created a different look with digitally, obviously, you know. So I'm not against it in certain situations, but generally, I don't think the past should really look any different than today, you know. So
what do you think about shooting a movie on one lens and one lens only?
Well, I mean, it's kind of a lot of the classic movies that I love were only shot on one lens. I mean, I can't be specific, but, you know, James Wong Howe didn't have the range of lenses that we have now. No way. So, you know, a film like HUD was not shot on very many lenses, if more than one. I don't actually know, but...
And how did that affect the movie, would you say?
Well, I think it goes back to the thing why I like to move the camera, you know, instead of changing the lens. You got to think what you're doing. I love the fact that, I mean, those films seems, especially James Wong Howe's films, they seem so well considered. It's a different way of shooting where you have multiple cameras and you just sort of zoom in to catch a close-up. It's about coverage, so many films now. But those films that we really like, those classic films weren't. John Ford never shot coverage. He shot the shot he wanted, you know. He tracked out the door with John Wayne into the wide emptiness. I mean, it was very specific. And I say, they didn't have the lens choice we have now. Obviously, they didn't have the technology we have now. They don't have the way of moving the camera we have now. But look what they created. They created real stories with real emotion, human emotions.
When you were starting out, did you always end up on the wider spectrum of lenses?
No, actually, no. When I was starting out, I didn't. No, I think the first really wide lens film I did was Barton Fink, when I started working with Joel and Ethan. They'd been working with Barry, and they'd been working very wide lenses. So it was interesting when the first few shots we were doing, they were going, "What lens are you on?" And I go, 32. "Oh, we thought you'd be on an 18. And then, so I'd go slightly wider. I'd go on a 27 or something, and oh, okay. You know, it was always a little bit longer than they thought, but it was kind of wider than I would normally been used to. But that was their style. But no, when I did 1984, for instance, no, I mean, it was the same range as lenses I'd be using today, really. It came really from more from my stills work, I suppose, just the way I see. I say, like being with a character and, a sort of reasonable mid close-up would be a 50 and an over-the-shoulder would be a 32 or a 35.
So basically it comes from what you see, from what your eye sees.
Yes. Yeah, my sensibility, I suppose. Yeah, but I mean, the directors I work with as well. But then I guess we work together because we see things in a similar way, As I say, that was the only thing with Joel and Ethan. They had been used to shooting wider, and I was used to shooting slightly longer. So we most of the time hit somewhere in the middle, actually. It was kind of funny.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think sometimes when you go very wide, it takes you back a little bit because it's so stylized in a way. You're not in the middle of it when it's really wide.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's whether you're wide on a close-up or wide to get in a whole space.
Right.
I mean, their films are something conceptual about their films. There's something. Obviously, they're more stylized than I mean, certainly more stylized than a film like 1984 or a film like Jarhead or something. It's a very considered, almost kind of paint book way of making a movie in some way.
Which is a wonderful effect.
Yes, it's a wonderful effect. I mean, it's like you look at a Wes Anderson film or something. It's similar. It's very kind of not contrived. That sounds derogatory. It's not
considered.
But it is. It's a world that is not quite what you see every day, but it's totally believable. And so the wide lenses kind of they really suit that kind of way of storytelling, isn't it?
But it seems to me that if you start shooting that way and you're just telling a story, you can't, in the middle of the film, switch over to long lenses if the story is continuous and we're not talking flashbacks or anything like that.
Right. I don't know. It'd be interesting to very slowly change the lens length. So if you were starting a film, you're shooting a close-up on a 27, and by the end of the film, you're shooting the same character on a 65 or 70. I don't know if it's ever been done, but it would be interesting how you're kind of altering the perspective. I mean, I know I've shot films where you've actually been with two characters and you've started with one more strongly at one point and then segued into the other character. And I was thinking about Sicario, where you're basically between Emily's character and Benicio's character. And at one point, the perspective shifts and you go with Benicio to see that. I wonder if you'd have gone sort of been wideish with Emily and then gone longer with her and then gone wider with Benicio. It would have been a bit of a hard thing to keep control of, but it might be an interesting effect.
Yeah, I think that sounds really interesting, but you'd really have to plan it out because if you were going longer and longer and longer, you wouldn't want to get to the shot at the end where, it's a tiny room, we can't do a long lens.
That's it, yeah.
You really have to plan it ahead of time. Yeah. But I think that would be really fun if there was a reason.
Yeah. I think it would have to be more constructive, more stylized film for it to be. But, sometimes you would shoot a scene and you'll shoot it on long lenses than another part. I mean, we did that quite a bit on Man Who Wasn't There. Scene would be a wide lens, and you get the feeling like if you look at, wide lenses, you look at Orson Welles films, Now, you look at Orson Welles' Touch of Evil, and you want to look at wide lenses, look at those wide lenses. Fantastic use of wide lenses. And that kind of great distortion on Welles's face, that kind of lowering, like the threat of the character because of the way he's using the lenses. And then contrast that with, what should we say? What's a long lens film where it's not? Well, you could say contrast that with HUD if you like, or which is much more kind of mid-level lenses and slightly more observational. It's not trying to exaggerate or kind of in any way.
So it would be interesting to look at different movies and look at it. Look at it with the thought of their lens choice.
Yeah. I look at Strangelove. Actually, Dr. Strangelove's a very good one to look at right now, actually, because but look at the lenses in Dr. Strangelove. It's very interesting because there's a whole sequence in there where the military is trying to take over the base to stop the commander sending to get the code, So there's Sterling Hayden and Peter Sellers kind of, fighting the American army outside. And there's a whole part of that's shot kind of handheld, sort of documentary-ish on slightly longer lenses. But then you come back in later with Sellers when he's playing such Strangelove in, the command room, whatever you call it. And it's like these wide lenses and there's sort of surreal quality to it. So that is a film. You look at the stuff in The Bombers with Keegan Wynn and that, and it's not distorted. It feels like you're there. There's a kind of reality to it. But I say, when he's shooting Strangelove, it's all kind of slightly over the top and funny. And it's not just lenses, obviously, but that was the success of the film, is the sort of cynicism. You're looking at something that's ultra realistic, but that's being controlled by this crazy man in this surreal world that, talk about living in bunkers. Anyways, but that's a very good one for the choice of lens, but also the way the camera's used, I think.
So it's good to be looking at films and thinking lenses and seeing how you can make something appear a certain way just by your lens choice.
Yeah,
which is good.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's context, because like in Strangelove, it's using the lens in a certain context to create a certain feel. But I mean, it's mainly that's how they work, I guess,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very hard to. I'm just trying to envision a romance or a romantic film where the character's been shot on a very wide lens. It's the nearest thing has been Terry Malick's work, really. But you would never see that in the past. I think it's changing. People's perceptions are changing, and the way lenses are used is changing. Well,
it seems like the longer lenses, because it puts the background softer, gives you a softer feel in a way.
Well, yeah, you'll think about something like a Vilma Madigan or something like that. All very long lenses and all very out of focus backgrounds and poetic and slow motion and all that stuff. See, Terry Malick's films, some of them are very kind of romantic. Or the scenes in them that are like that, but it's all quite wide lenses, so it is interesting. But he doesn't really shoot close-ups like the way other people do. Yeah.
Well, this is probably a good place to stop, even though we could go on and on about lenses. Maybe it's a good idea to look at your favorite movie now and look for which lenses the cinematographer chose, and think about how that changed the way the story was told. Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics.